song.
The harmonica got me. It's so perfect. Welcome, everybody. Please settle in. We'll kick off in a minute or two.
I've been singing this song for a long time now,
I've been singing this song for a long time. That's good. That's good. Good day to everybody. Hi, Jean, Joan, Ryan, everyone who I see physically. I see Paul and everyone who's here. We will kick off with the sixth module, which is technically the 7th week of Kernel, which leaves us 1 week after this one. And we will be getting into a topic called scaling principled games. Prior to that, I just want to say thank you really to most everyone who has spent time exploring Expo Week and deciding whether or not it's a good fit for you. We are very close to the lineup being set. There are well over things in the in-between spaces, and we welcome everybody to be there, no matter if you want to present otherwise, to just kind of let them to shift with you, and to know that everything that we do really is an unfinished part of a longer game. And so we're excited to just show a snapshot of where people are today and enjoy the time really with one another. Dry run is tomorrow. There's gonna be a lot of people there. We're trying to figure out what to do about that, but it'll be fun. Dry run will be. And Ali and I are on it. We think most likely we'll have fellows with other fellows to just kind of like dry run, enjoy, and like get to hear each other's projects as well. So if you and me and you want to be there as a listener, that will be chat information. And if you are willing to be a listener tomorrow, we can assign you and make sure that you meet some other fellows. So that's what's next. But here we are for Fireside as always. I will pass the mic to Andy, who will get us going into scaling principled games.
Hello, welcome. I think today is one of my favorites and also most nerve-wracking modules to do. If you are with us, you will know that Kernel has this spirally effect in many ways. And coming back to Duende and the deep struggle is a part of each block that I always look forward to and am nervous about in equal parts. Because inevitably there's some particular aspect of my own life that ends up being about this interplay between serenity and duende, one of the most potent complementary opposites I have come across. And each of us will have our own different words to describe it. The words are not really what's important. It's the meaning that shines within them that points at something really essential about these two features of our work, of our lives, and of the way in which the path unfolds. Whatever path it is that you walk along, and whichever way you go, there are moments of real peace and insight and joy and ecstasy and ease. And then there are moments of total constraint, difficulty, darkness, concern, fear, anger, frustration. And how are we to understand the flipping between all of these different states? The module presents some potential ways of thinking about this. The most important, I suppose, is to learn how to listen to and tell better stories, which is the personal inquiry this week, as well as censorship resistance, the fact that no story should be made inaccessible based on an arbitrary rule set or a conventional decision maker. These two things, when applied in concert, when applied in harmony, lead to environments in which we can learn to listen to more and more different perspectives, where we can tell more and more different kinds of stories, and where that has an ongoingness which is a mirror of life itself. In my own life, it has become clear, I think, that birth is the complementary opposite of death. Life itself just goes on. There's a famous poem from Robert Frost in this regard, where he says, "In 3 words, I can summarize everything I know about life. It goes on." So simple, so profound. And when we are able to reflect that ongoingness, both in our own being, the way that we listen and respond to the world, as well as in the systems that we relate to and within, then there is the possibility of serenity and struggle interfering constructively to produce something really beautiful, something fractal, something worthy of making its way onto Daniel's wall, where all truly great art and science finally finds its home. And in some really important and deep way, that does bring us to the introduction of today's guest, a dear friend of mine and many people in Kernel, who's been with us now for quite a few blocks. Feels like many lives, to be honest, Daniel, but has introduced a great depth of complexity to the way that we think about Kernel, the way that we think about ourselves, the way we think about the syllabus, the way we think about schooling, science, so much else. Daniel is the organizer of Complexity Weekend. He is actively involved in all kinds of influence across our internet. And he is most known, in my mind, as a producer of fringe juxtapositional content. Probably my favorite phrase at the moment. we can look at that. But Daniel is also a Kernel Fellow, first and foremost in the context of this discussion. And in speaking about what we would do today, we want to get to a genuine fireside discussion, a genuine open space for all of us to look together at these seeds of struggle and serenity and how they manifest in our lives, what it means to us to deal with these particular pieces of the spiral. So I am not going to open with a question, Daniel, if you don't mind. If you have anything to say in response to what I have kind of laid out as the intro here, or if anybody in the audience would care to open up about some particular aspect of this week's module, or your thoughts on complexity, your thoughts on struggle, your thoughts on serenity, it would be a privilege to start with other voices today.
Okay, I'll say hello since someone asked, did we lose him? No, not yet. So thanks a lot for the invitation and introduction. It's been definitely an adventure and a bi-directional experience in kernel. So we don't have much prepared, but the module 6 was very rich. And I think just the space we can have today with us here, questions that people are bringing up, the relationship with technical systems and the changes in Ethereum. There's a lot of topics that would be awesome to explore. If I will just give one other note, that slide shown with the work of the poet William Blake and the inventor / person Bucky Fuller, it speaks perhaps more broadly to the ability to just juxtapose two or more things and find some third space meaning. Various two lives could have been juxtaposed, and that's in a more historical mode. But then, of course, there's something that also happens in the synchronous juxtaposition, which is online for a lot of situations. And that doesn't just kind of reveal some historical coincidence or interesting detail, but that's actually something that becomes co-creative. So that's something really great about conversation and about improvisation and kernel.
Wonderful. I hope to get to improvisation and improv in general in the course of today's fireside discussion. The place that a comment in the chat might indicate as a good starting point is please say anything about ants. I will try and also, say anything about ants, literally. That would be delightful and really just a funny and lighthearted place to begin. But also, as it relates to some of the deeper work going on here, it seems to me like there is a really, really interesting thread to tug on in terms of the relationship of struggle to evolution in natural systems. And I wonder if your study of ants and anything that you could say about ants would relate the importance of struggle and discomfort to evolutionary processes.
Anything on ants, please? First, just to complete the request. Okay. 2, serenity and struggle, dialectic, and ants and evolution. So for graduate school, for 5 years, I did field work at the long-term field site of my advisor, Professor Deborah Gordon, in the southern Arizona, US region. And so spent a lot of time watching ants, but also working with them in different ways, like different aspects of data collected from ants, just to the more scientific side. And there's been a long history of ant watching and observing and thinking about that ant conversation that's happening when the nestmates are touching synchronously, or when there's the nest construction and the pheromones asynchronously. And how ants as a group, who all live in groups of multiple nestmates, and some of them are living in every place one can imagine, how there are different strategies and algorithms for perhaps principled games or whatever the ant analog is, how those algorithms evolve and how that's associated with changes on the nestmate's body, like how they're perceiving and thinking and acting, and changes in the algorithm that may or may not require the nestmate to change, and the environment. So a lot of that work, Professor Gordon has done a lot of connections with algorithms, computer science, and behavior, as many others have. So that's an area that one could explore. To struggle and serenity, well, without probably excessive projection, we won't be able to directly say about the ants, but in that juxtaposition of what the ants are doing in the field in Arizona or wherever, and then what we're doing as people, just one ant specific thought that maybe helps us approach that very challenging intersection is there's many colonies that are out there on this field, and there's sometimes a focus on describing the conflicts within the colony, and that is often framed within like a struggle around reproduction. Then there's colonies interacting with each other and some of the conversations or conflicts that they have, which is kind of in an aggression space. And then there's also the colony versus reality / the weather, with the monsoon and the loss of water. So you can go forage, but there's uncertainty around foraging. So even if there was no other conflict within the colony or between colony, there's still like that entropic struggle. So maybe just some of those different levels of interaction and conflict help us think about our groups.
I would love to hear some further questions if others have truly. I don't want to fall into the usual pattern of firesides here, and there's so much to be said on struggle and our own experience of natural environments. So please.
If I may ask if Blue might be willing to expand upon your comments in this context, could really help us move to interesting dialogue.
Sure. So I don't know. I have like a preformed bunch of bias about working with Daniel because we've worked together for many years now. But when I think about struggle and serenity, it reminds me of conversations that I've had with Daniel about ant brain dissections. So when you're doing something that's really difficult, I mean, this happens like with the finest set of tweezers you've ever seen under a microscope, and the tweezers are actually like sharpened under a microscope, like ultra fine forceps, and like, you know, maybe some iridectomy scissors, or I'm not sure really about the ant brain dissection specifically, but when you're doing something that's so incredibly difficult and challenging, you have to do it in serenity or you will fail. And so if you're tired, have had too much coffee, if your hands are shaking, if you're emotionally disturbed in any way, like you have to have the utmost serenity to do something that is such an intense, complicated, intricate struggle to like pull out a piece of an ant brain. So he and I have both dissected small things. And so my conversations with Daniel about dissecting ant brains reminded me of the struggle and serenity topic.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. I can add to this because it's so fringe juxtapositional in this like reality, right? That both of you have spent time doing just that, which dissecting an ant's brain is something that not many of us have been able to experience. And it reminds me a lot of the Learn Track juntas that we had yesterday. And this tends us perhaps more towards like the learning how to learn. And on this slide, it speaks of learning not as the acquisition of knowledge, but powered by 4 characteristics. It says a sincere desire to know, a disciplined determination to practice, passion, and a clear heart. And I think, Blue, you just spoke to this in many ways about like all of these things having to come together, and the serenity and struggle, how they meet in that moment where you have to be there in order to find the kind of middle way. And what came up in that discussion was teachers, basically. Who are some of our teachers that move us towards this sense of wonder? And the noticeable characteristic, which I know Joan was there, Vanessa was there. You're welcome, of course, to chime in as time goes on. We were noticing, I think, that many of our teachers had this this sense of wonder that they themselves were in it and completely enraptured by whatever it was that they were spending time on, whether it be ants or French or a specific branch of science or the piano, and how that like sense of rapture seemed to be between struggle and serenity in some sense. So I suppose that's another place that we can meander.
Thank you, Vivek, and also Blue. So to the dissections, I see it as one of many motor behaviors that many people practice in all different ways, like playing an instrument and so on. Most people haven't been exposed to the apparatus and sat down at a microscope, like with a frozen ant and the right tools. But in all situations where that happened with students of different ages, they always could dissect it, at least one, if they wanted to. And so it's much like an instrument. Like there's being able to press the keys on the trumpet, and then there's actually, and move your lips, and then there's actually playing trumpet, which I don't do. But just giving an example as something that also is very motor based, and you can train on and be in the flow state, like Blue mentioned in the chat. And it's something like the similarities and differences in the things that we like that we can talk about. It's why it's okay to like different kinds of music, or talk about different art that one enjoys, or just have art that has a different vibe or mood, because it's not like there's one flow state that's preferable. And because flow states have so much enculturation and amount of just physical practice differently in different situations, there is some tinge of motivation and like discipline, like I am going to practice this for this many hours, even if it's not what I instantaneously want to do. And so having tact and balance for the marathon, and being able to balance that, kind of like the serenity and struggle, like even just on the fractal scale within the day, like some time of more focus, even if it's just a few minutes, some time of more relaxation.
One of the things that this brings up for me, Daniel, is the similarity, or not similarity, but the notion of relevance realization, especially as it relates to struggle. Because as you say, anybody can sit down at an electron microscope and with the appropriate tools do an action. Anybody can put a trumpet to their lips and make some noise occur and press the keys. But to then become a maestro in either of these domains, indeed in any domain, takes a certain amount of what is on the slide called a desire to know, that's sincere discipline, determination to practice passion and a clear heart. And it reminds me of this conversation that you had with John Favicki, where he's discussing the interplay of virtue and virtuosity. It's so interesting what he said there, right? That virtue without virtuosity is no good, put to bad ends, right? But virtuosity without virtue is cheapened. And that's so interesting to me. And again, it seems to play into this notion of both principles and struggle, right? That there seems to be something really indistinguishable about struggle and the development of virtue and virtuosity. So I wonder if that rings any notes.
Well, when I was looking through the materials earlier, I saw a lot of changes related to Ethereum, and the new Ethereum call sign or whatever it is related to serenity. So others who are more familiar with that can know. And there's aspects of that struggle, serenity, and all these other things like randomness and beyond. Like, there has to be a competition for the blocks to occur, whatever that mechanism is. Then maybe that enables some other situation to have more serenity. Like, now these people don't have to worry about this transaction being reversed because of this competition. And then what can they do with that serenity and the space it opens and kind of like the dynamic range it enables? Maybe another struggle. And then there's a lot of complex relationships with which serenities and struggles we want to undertake and which ones technology and our niche can undertake.
The notion of niches is an interesting one and applies well to what we might call communities of practice. There's a specific niche of Ethereum researchers that hangs out at ETH research. If you go on ETH research with .ch, you'll find a very particular niche of person who is working actively on everything from the rich incentives working group to the implementation of zero knowledge EVMs to some really abstruse and highly specific technologies, techniques, and possible investigations into what it might mean to have a planetary scale computing surface. The thing that this reminds me of is Brewster Kahl's comment in our module 3 Fireside. We're not looking for a global village. We're looking for a globe of villages. And, you have that same reference, except it's different colonies on a plain in Arizona and how they relate to one another, both in conflict and collaboration. And I wonder, like, are there lessons from your work, either as a scientist and researcher or as a field observer, on the kinds of conflicts in particular that lead to interesting outcomes? And how are we to think about that?
All right, thanks. Very interesting. So first to the ending question about different scales of conflict, and then to niche. One helpful idea and one that resonates for some innately and also has some scientific basis and good tools exist to work with is thinking about individuality in a multi-scale setting. And so there's systems of different spatial and temporal extent, and they're nested within each other. And the interactions within and between layers can just be said to be complex and investigated further. Like immune system, there's interactions within and between levels and bodies and so on, and the microbiome. And instead of trying to defend a narrow immune system concept and then always be surprised by these exceptions and so on, one could just consider the system as is with all these interacting individualities that came about differently. So then which ones are productive? That's the starting point for the conversation. So that's great. And then to the niche question, it is funny that niche, I guess, in an era of mass everything-ism, niche is semi-pejorative. Like, it's not going to expand beyond its quote niche, but even a species with a global distribution is still in its niche, its temporal niche and the microhabitats it lives in. And just more broadly, a niche is whatever that thing is fitting into. Because if it's not fitting into a niche, it doesn't exist as that kind of thing. So it's always fit to its niche for systems that exist. Not every hypothesized system will be fit to any given niche, but whatever things are in the niche is what they're fit to. So that's very interesting to think about with different social visions and what kinds of niches people are fit for and how they interact with their niche.
Once again, going to encourage some questions from the wider audience before I continue down a very niche topic. Thank you for the smile, Dunya. I appreciate it.
If I had one thing, Andy, it would be that this idea of niche topics and uncensored learning. I think that there was a reason that that particular phrase has made its way into this module. That's what's called to me as we talk about this idea of a globe of villages, different colonies on the plane, and what niches look like, how they feel to be explored.
One thought on that to connect this question of social niches in especially a modern or digital context, and then the earlier discussion on our motor behavior and practices and skills. Those settings that are around us physically may be absurdly challenging, like one who cannot pick a safe or play trumpet. But a lot of the context is there in terms of like gravity, friction, having seen other people do something similar imagining how something could be used, but not necessarily being able to enact it, but being able to imagine how the trumpet could sound. In the digital, as people have brought up from many different perspectives, the context provided is different. So synchronous and asynchronous real communities and all that that entails. And some people focus more on like education or research, others focus more on different areas of that interface, how the context constitutes that niche. Because if nothing is provided from online, you have people who are separated from each other informationally, but might be like thinking about something similar. And then maybe on some other extreme level of connectedness, like everyone is in the two-way neural tech situation, and like everybody is being kind of tethered in what they're experiencing.
Yeah, it's really beautiful, Daniel. Thank you. And I mean, I see Blue's question in the chat and Dunya's. Where do other living systems fit into the niche? Are they part of it, or are they separate? And also how they evolve. If either of you want to, I'll pause for a second if you'd like to expand. Otherwise, I can keep going. The type of evolve is, or how the niche evolves. This is an interesting thing to me. It's you said something, Daniel, that I want to make sure I understand about how niches are not exactly niches anymore. And I think about like the types of information propagation that can feel cancerous. They can feel like a particular niche has taken a stronghold, or have somehow inhibited our ability to learn in an uncensored fashion. I think about basically like how information currently propagates on the internet, and the way that it seems like there are like cancerous growths that you can speak of from like a knowledge propagation perspective or a memetics perspective. And like this question that Dunya asks is how a niche evolves, how they die and are birthed, how they mix or bump into. These continue to remain important as even as niches are subcultures, right? It reminds me of Toby Shoren's in module 2 talking about us as cultural creators, engineers. There's a slightly different term that he used that maybe somebody will remember. But this is where my head is at, where I'm feeling, where your comments led me.
Just to give one way that it's often been framed, just in conversation and in more researchy ways of investigating it, to the question of Blue, where do other living systems fit into the niche? Are they part of it or separate? We can think of like a view from above if we have total visibility of a system. And then at that point, whatever the entities are, is just as it's being modeled. And then there's kind of the view from the bottom, a view from the inside of the system, where other living systems, like on the screen, it's like, are other living systems part of the niche? It's like, well, in my physical surrounding space, only the light and sound patterns, which themselves are not living. And then in the internet wires, it's a different representation. And then, yes, I believe that there's another person with a peripersonal space. So that's like the model of the situation. And then depending on how one is modeling the niche and like whether they're thinking about the informational niche like where the edges are other internet servers, then some parts of that phenomena will be more relevant. If it was the social niche considered as like the way that we interface with each other as beings, then the edges can be considered as social. So it's all part of an integrated mesh, and different boundaries or patterns or coherences might become more relevant over some spatial or temporal scale or context. Then Blue wrote, thinking about cancerous elements in the body, these can be thought of informationally as parts of the system that have decided to isolate and be uncooperative, i.e. have reverted to being single-celled organisms. And that's the line that Mike Levin at Tufts has been investigating, and others, with a system's cooperation in large systems being conditioned upon it doing something that from a narrower perspective might not be optimal, but becomes part of a larger system. But it's, if only it were the same at any scale, then there wouldn't be any issues with what was niche or mass. But it's kind of that difference in strategy with a shorter versus larger or just different horizon.
The work of Michael Levin is truly fascinating, and you might find some links to it in Kernel Slack if you want to go Slack diving, which is a wonderful weekend activity for the whole family. But Daniel, one of the points I want to pick up there is this notion of scale. You've mentioned it a few times, right? Like spatio-temporal, both of these things. And the topic of this week's module is scaling principal games. And I wonder, you know, there's something interesting about Levin's work in that he's looking at how you might reinstitute the same electric potential across cells as a means of reincorporating that single cell organism back into the overall system, and therefore stopping the spread of the cancer. There's something about that notion of potential as it relates to the boundary, the relevance, and the interface between all of these different niches, the way that information is passed between distinct yet coextensive bodies. That's what an interface means, distinct yet coextensive body. And there's something about, you know, are there any ways in nature where like information may be passed between in a scale independent manner, or does that just violate something fundamental?
Well, thanks. Just to give a few notes from the module, in the very first paragraph, or the second one, the first part though, it describes, we've highlighted how economic code, which distributes value by virtue of how it is expressed, constitutes a new class of performative speech acts of a most meaningful kind. So that was very interesting, because with the speech interface, digital written speech or spoken word, that's an interface in that social context. In the pure interpersonal performative speech acts space, things people say to each other in person that are performative speech acts, it could be like any number of examples of where the speech declares the event to have occurred. Like, I now pronounce you ... or I'm going to count down 3, 2, 1, and then when I say go, this is going to happen. Digital interfaces are enabling performative speech acts that can have commitments to them, like past commitments to some ledger or some other kind of commitment, or locking something, burning something, transferring something, and then of course signing something, which is explored in the signature economies area of kernel and in kernel building kernel. So I think that's quite interesting to explore, like what kinds of declarative speech acts, just stating something, interrogative speech acts, asking a question, questions, performative, all the different categories of speech and types of ways of thinking about that. And then which ones are easier or harder or enabled or different in a digital space, where if you say like, I promise to pay you this much of that in this much time, there's one thing when that's a promise in person, but then there's another level of interface that's enabled when that doesn't even need to be mentioned. That person has just made that commitment and it's going to be enacted that way. And they can just consider that asset gone, simplify their understanding of what they have and what they're needing to remain obliged to somebody else for.
One of the points that this makes me reflect on is the notion of that which is submerged, and not necessarily in a negative, not as in repressed necessarily, but what Daniel is perhaps pointing at is like that which can be taken as given, right? Which is actually the meaning of the word datum, something given. Given not in the sense of a gift, but as in established as fact, although there is this fascinating double-directedness in the word that calls up the notion of gift while also being established as fact. And these things so often, like there's so much submerged context in our interactions, in person or digitally. The complaint that is often raised is that there is less submerged in the digital. That's how I read so many of these conversations about like the paucity of personal interaction over Zoom or whatever it is that like all of that stuff that is submerged, not repressed, submerged in our ordinary interactions is not really as accessible in the digital, or it's made explicit. It has this light shone on it and is therefore destroyed, right? Because to observe a phenomena is to change it, and that's something really fascinating to me, because it brings me back to this point that haunts me truly about the duende piece, right? I don't know if anybody else has this experience in life where they're sometimes haunted by work that they've done. The duende piece does this to me in really difficult to describe ways. But one aspect of it is that like it has this notion that anything may rise to the poetic. Poetry not necessarily as some particular form of words on a page or something, but as an intensity of awareness. And the intensity of our awareness is such an interesting phase. It's such an interesting phrase when we're thinking about like that which is submerged in any of these interfaces, in any of these acts, because like a certain kind of like intense awareness sounds almost it's very masculine and penetrating. Like but it's not actually. There's something diffuse and ecological about the awareness that duende is really talking about, which it has me reflect on so much that is not really easy to speak. And that's exactly the point, is that it's not available there because its existence depends on it being submerged. And that's so much a part for me of where serenity and struggle actually come together, is not just the acceptance of that which is like submerged, but the awareness of it in integrative ways. That, and when I say integrative, I don't mean to pull it then into consciousness and like work with it as if you were like, you know, a classical psychotherapist who's not going to just, you know, individuate and conquer the shadow. It's much more about that ecological awareness that allows for what is submerged to keep its poetry and its poesis, its becoming, without saying that it has to be, without saying that like this is the solution, or this thing will save us, or here is the savior, you know, that most dangerous of psychological impulses. So it's not really a question, but this has really been moving with me this week as we've had some of these yuntos, and as we invited Nora Bateson in to talk about Afani poesis, and the notion of readying, rather than looking at a theory of change, trying to understand what are the conditions that lead to change at all, because those conditions seem so much more opposite to the kinds of change which end up taking place. And they all unnecessarily merged or hidden. And so if anybody has thoughts on how the hidden may remain hidden while being shared, I'm fascinated to hear perspectives on this. Ryan, please, no need to raise your hand. Just go for it.
What I've been, Colonel is like personally leading me to this place of creating as an act of fiction, meaning that whatever I have to offer is fundamentally my truth, but in the truth of in the context of others and how they perceive reality. I don't even know if that makes sense, but designing, I guess, as an act of fiction, because my limited perspective is worth nothing but for the act of everybody else's attention and whatever they the gift of others' attention, I should say. And I wanted to share something. I guess it ties to it, but when I was a kid, I think it was a freshman in high school. I went to school with a kid that when the career counselor came in and asked everybody like what their plans were for school or after high school or whatever, this kid who was kind of the outcast said he wanted to study ants. And everybody laughed at this kid, including me. And I vividly remember this moment. And he just said, I want to study ants. And at the time, I like judged him for it. And fast forward to my first interaction with Colonel, Daniel was leading the interview process. And his opening of Colonel, and again, I didn't really do much research on Colonel, and here I am in an interview. And he said something along the lines of, well, the only thing I can share about what kernel is through my personal perspective. And what Daniel went on to say over 40 seconds, it didn't make any sense to me. Like, it just kind of blew my mind in a way that I was just kind of confused. And I was like, I left being like, what is kernel? I'm more confused now than I was at the beginning. And the funny thing about it was that first interview that we all went through was on silence, or at least my group went through was on silence. So I thought the game had already begun. And when he proposed this prompt in the interview process, I stayed silent. I was like, the game has begun. I am not answering the question. I'm not sharing my perspective that he asked in my interview. I'm staying silent. I'm going to win this game by staying silent, whatever. Anyways, now at the end of this block period, I'm realizing, having learned and experienced from Daniel, from his perspective, and not even directly, but just through these interactions and reading some of his work, I'm learning what his perspective was. And now if I went back to that interview and went back to see what his perspective of kernel was, it would make more sense. And now weeks later, it's like I joked in the chat, it's like this ant talk makes complete sense, because now we have this shared language, this shared understanding of ants and all this stuff, and emergent learning and all this stuff. It's like now it all makes sense. And now to get even more meta, now the call to adventure is like, oh, we must have the ant's perspective. Like, now we must think like an ant, and how an ant communes with others. All that to say, is that my personal struggle, my personal constraint was being isolated, being uncooperative, not integrating, talking with people, especially on the internet, because of fear and all these things. And I think my main learning is that, or the call is that by having other people's perspectives, then that's when we can reimagine ourselves. And by reimagining ourselves, we're in fiction and anything's possible, I guess I want to say. So thank you, Daniel. Appreciate you and love you, brother.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. That's very meaningful. I'm glad that we can re-listen to this one, and that's very deep and important about coming to know others' perspectives by relating to them and having a space where the relationship can be kept open and nurtured ecologically. Meowie?
Hey, side note, my 10-year high school reunion a while back, that kid ended up studying ants. He went through with it, and Lord knows what he's given to the earth because he's stuck with his dream as the isolated savant in the corner that everybody laughed at.
Meowie, is your Linux machine allowing you to unmute?
Oh, yes, it is. I just thought Ryan has something else more to add, so I was kind of quiet. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. While I was listening to Ryan, that when he mentioned that his uncooperativeness with on internet with strangers and others, that reminds me of our first kernel vibe hour call. I remember we talked something about how the thread of connections, and we all talked about our roots, like where we started and how we are here. It's just, even though along the line our journey didn't make any sense, but well, it's connected in one way or another. We are heading there. So yeah, I just wanted to add that it's the thread of connection. Even if things doesn't make any sense, somewhere along the line, it will make sense. So, and coming on here on Kernel, when I hosted the first Vibe Hour calls, my thought was that I want a place where I want to control the conversation. It can be anything and everything. And I'm really proud of the conversations that we have produced along the line, which doesn't make sense in the beginning, of course, nowhere. But towards the end, it just makes more sense than anything else. And I want to quote Tatiana. I know that she's here. She mentioned that the conversations are really nutritious. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you.
Thanks, Maui. To build on that nutrition metaphor, there's the macronutrients that are reconstituting the body and the micronutrients, smaller amounts, but then kind of continuums and other complexities. And then also the nutrition has to be acquired through foraging. And foraging has risks and costs and so on, even in the supermarket or in the desert or any ecosystem. And so it's not just like as people were in the pod getting the injection of nutrition. That's one view of how nutrition could be maintained. And then there's other modes of getting nutrition, and some of them may have periods where it's more boring, or some of them may have higher risks of different kind. And so if we only avoid boredom, or if we only avoid risk, the foraging strategy that might occur might be very suboptimal on some other area.
Dunya, love that.
Thank you, Vivek. Listening to Meow and we've been hosting these kinder kernel calls. Well, supposedly I've been hosting them, and I had like this panic attack that I didn't want to host anything. And everyone was like, no, you don't need to do anything. So, but it created a space, and it sounds like that Vibe Hour was also, it's like this place, because we keep on returning to it over time. And it seems like even when I think of foraging, like now I'm new here in southern Nova Scotia, and the longer I spend here, like the more I'm like, ooh, cranberries, they're over there by the water here. And so there's this notion of forming a place where things get to be. I see how that's connected perhaps to niche, but also one thing that has felt really interesting is on one of the calls, on the kinder kernel calls, I was in a lot of pain, like extreme agonizing pain. And I actually didn't stay on the call. I left. And later on, I wondered, what if I had stayed on the call with my pain? What would, like, the possibility that invites? And so I think about this duende thing, because then the next week I was like on, and so we played all these games, and it was so much fun, and it was great, and so many things happened. But what about sharing that pain? And so that's a potential. Feels like that kinder kernel call needs to continue. That space needs to continue to exist, so that I can find out what it looks like to share the pain.
Thanks for sharing that. One related note is just, we heard multiple organizer or facilitator or hosting journeys in the last few minutes. And so that's like different people finding their social and digital niche, what channel, what location in the digital niche, and who and how to communicate, and how to set the before, the during, and the after. And just taking that first step, and then all those questions that come along with it. Like, how should the format change and how regular? What should the regime of attention be? What should the focus and the norms be? So it's just really important and special to hear. Meow, you had your hand raised?
Oh, I just wanted to respond to Donia that there are times when, like, it's just a tiny bit of things I want to add of what she said is that there are times that when we feel like we're in a much more pain, and if we feel this conflicting of thoughts that if we should share it or not, if it's gonna be understandable or not. I would say that depends on how comfortable you feel doing that. If you're okay with sharing those pain, I feel like that should be more welcome and more than welcome to do so. And there's this thread of trust can be built. But also at the same time, if you feel like you need time, you need to take some step back and then come back stronger. That is also really something really beautiful that should be considered. So yeah.
The lens of nurturing here is helpful to think what's nurturing, and then either way, it's okay. That's also what's nice here, is that there's a sense of, yeah, either way, it's okay.
Thanks. And to connect to the earlier discussions on the interfaces, there is this situation or phenomena as pain, named as pain, experienced as pain, different for different people. And then it feels healthy, or at the very least, it's what we just heard. There's like a mode of regeneration towards the community. If it feels like that person wants to stay in the situation or express it, however, and then there's another mode of needing to retreat, which was brought up second, and like taking just whatever that looks like, which in a digital setting can be extremely flexible, like taking a rest and or having food or any other number of things. Yeah, definitely. And related to the joy of missing out, because that's like the regenerative turn, the internal turn, like, and then there's the external turn. And so having those two opportunities for growth and for contributions and valuing them both feels like some healthy balance that many people can strike.
One of the points that this touches in me is in the piece on Gabriel Garcia Lorca. It is related that there is a great dancing competition held in the south of Spain, Andalus, that kind of area, where it is a competition to see who dances with the muse, and it's not the angels, it's something else. And all of these young women come, and they are incredible. Truly, they're just incredible. The amazing dancers, well practiced, beautiful women, beautiful dancers. And they all dance, and it's an amazing night. And people are caught up in the overwhelm of this experience of just experiencing such beauty. And then an old lady, 80 plus, stands up, and she throws her arms above her head, and she stamps 3 times. She does it with such duende that she wins hands. There's not a moment of doubt in the crowd. This is it. This is duende. And it's such a beautiful story, especially as it relates to pain and entropy, which is something that Daniel mentioned slightly earlier. Entropy one of the ways of thinking about it is entropy is only a result of the coarse graining of the system. And what we mean by that is entropy arises as a result of the variables we choose to describe and observe. This is not to say that entropy is like an emergent feature. You have to have some variables to describe and observe. You have to pick your variables. But the way that you choose your variables influences what entropy is. This is a fascinating observation as it relates to pain, decay, age, death, difficulty, struggle, these kinds of things which are a very, very real part of all of our lives. And when it's held with others, then we don't solve it, right? It's just that it becomes translucent, right? It lets the light through instead of being some obstacle to how we relate either to ourselves in that internal turn or to the people with whom we are in the external term. So what are my variables? That's something I think about sometimes on romantic evenings of self when I'm salsa dancing with my own confusion, Gave up making sense a long time ago. Now I just dance and hope one day to find some duende like that old Spanish lady.
Thanks, Andy. A few comments and aspects in the chat. So Ola asked, could you say more about the internal and external? And then Mariana wrote, instant engenders form, and form makes the instant visible. She flees her shadow up into the air. Then, Andy, you just mentioned transparency. It lets the light in/through. A system that's totally transparent is invisible. Like air is transparent-ish, so it's invisible. It lets the light, all the light through. And then if something is opaque, it blocks all the light, but then it's 100% the most visible it can be because you can't see behind it. So those, now you could be on the other side of something, or you could move your perspective to the other side of something. So it's not that just because you can't see through it from one angle that if you went to a different angle, you wouldn't see through it, and so on. But I think it really speaks to this internal and external, like others are opaque. Our screen is opaque. So how do we see through and not just imagine another internal simply? Because we can't walk a mile in their shoes. We're not going to be able to understand all of someone's context, so we can see it from their perspective broadly, maybe from some narrower focus. So just how the internal and the external block light, to Ola's question, perhaps, and what we want and what would be healthy for multi-scale systems with internal and external aspects that are digital. Well, I'll ask a question, Andy. It's almost the end of KB7. So what will be happening in the next week and month and year?
The next week, we will finish off some of the specific learning that we have been doing in various guilds, that we have been looking at together in various kinds of conversation. And we will say goodbye to this relative container, because it's another good skill to learn, and a difficult one, a really difficult one. And then a month from now, we will hopefully all be enjoying some time spent in retreat. Because as one of my teachers told me in a very direct and particular moment, a particular shared context, unless you retreat, you cannot know the victory that already is there. A really wonderful way of examining that same internal, external, translucent, opaque, complementary opposite. And a year from now, we will all most likely, in slightly different form and certainly in a very different context, be gathered again. Because we are familiar like that. The Arabic name for humans is Ins, or Insan. The first company that I ever worked at in South Africa is called Ins. It's not something that's widely known, but Insan, it means at once that which is familiar, right? It also means forgetful. Both of them are together. It's so funny, these Semitic languages and their triliteral root systems often have words which contain the opposites in the roots. So it's hinted at in its moment of expression, which is so fascinating. And so that which is most familiar to us, our humanity, is also that which is so forgetful. And there is something really wonderful and genuinely beautiful about that. There's something genuinely serene. The word itself means clear, right? Clear or fair. Isn't that fascinating? There's something serene in knowing your own forgetfulness, because by that dispensation of forgetting, the world is constantly renewed. And as things are constantly renewed, we get again and again the chance to remember. So, as is always the case, I hope that a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, we find ourselves in a turn where it is possible for us to remember.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I thank everybody again for being with us today. Daniel specifically for exploring with us in wide-ranging directions, as you always have. Really pushed us to consider more ecological ways of exploring across many dimensions. The Blake and the Bucky Fuller time specifically continues to be a source of inspiration, and that live stream I would put in the chat so that anyone who wants to can also enjoy this fringe juxtapositional content that is like really the heart of Kernel in a lot of ways. So really means a lot, Daniel. And for everyone who's been here with us today, really thank you. Everyone who spoke up, everyone who's listened, it really is the whole story. It's like some type of dialogue that touches things that we won't be able to specifically point to. And to Daniel's point, like sometimes can feel boring or meandering or confusing, but is a particular way that we choose to spend time. So it means a lot, and we'll be back next week for a little bit of a lot of things. Obviously, Adventure Time tomorrow prepares us for Expo Week next week. So many people are sharing stories of different kinds there. make your way to whichever day feels comfortable, feels enjoyable. If you can't or don't want to make it to Expo, that's completely fine. There's a vibe hour and a kinder kernel also happening. And there are all sorts of niches and pockets that we hope that you will explore, whether in kernel or beyond. And we hope you go really well. We hope you go really well on your Thursday. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.